I'm going to tell you about a hamlet of squatters, some of whom were Methodists, on Newtown Mountain, which is in the parish of Penycae. We're going to look at how the hamlet began and developed and declined and eventually disappeared. And we're going to look at something of what the two Methodist chapels did, one Welsh, one English. And because of Methodism, I've chosen to have this verse from one of Charles Wesley's hymns on this opening slide. He speaks, and listening to his voice, new life the dead receive. The mournful broken hearts rejoice. The humble poor believe. Here's a photograph of the mountain. It seems to have three names: Wrexham Mountain, Penycae Mountain, or Newtown Mountain, but I dare say that's because one name covers a larger area and another name describes a smaller part of the same area, but that's what it looks like. And here you see a footpath which runs through the settlement that I'm going to be telling you about. The Wrexham leader said in January 2009, "It is probable that many people in the area have never even heard of the Wrexham village of Newtown Mountain. The settlement has long been abandoned and almost forgotten." And here you see two other views of what the mountain looks like on a different sort of day as far as weather's concerned. I was going for a walk with my grandson and he took those photographs. Now, the settlement was made up of houses which were known as Tai Norse. There's a photograph of one in a different part of North Wales. A Tai Norse is called what it is because it had to be built in the course of one night. You started at sundown, and by the morning you had to have smoke coming out of the chimney. So you'd have your friends and your neighbours, your family come and help you, and mostly they would be made of turf to start with. By morning there was smoke coming out of your chimney and it was your home, and you now had the right to live there and to have a small piece of land around it. After a year you were allowed to replace it if you wanted to with a stone house. And here we see a couple of other Tai Norse, again in North Wales, but again not on Wrexham Mountain. A man called Lee preached at the Primitive Methodist Chapel in 1863, which we'll think about in a little while, and after the service he was entertained to tea at the home of one of the congregation. He gives quite a good description of the house. Here's what he says. The hut in which he lived was made of sods. The roof timbers were of branches of trees from the plantations over the brook, covered and made watertight by layers of sods. To get inside we had to stoop very considerably. The furniture consisted of a round table, 2 homemade seats, a box for a third party, and a homemade bed, which I thought was a couch. The table was no sooner set than a hen jumped onto it and began pecking at the loaf. I took the liberty of knocking it off. I was quite ready for my tea and enjoyed it. From the description I have given of the huts, it can easily be conceived that the beds were as short as possible. During the tea I kept looking at the bed. My host, noticing this, said, "You keep looking at our bed." I replied, "If that is your bed, it is a very short one." "Yes, it is short," he said, "because we cannot get a longer one in the room. But you see it answers a double purpose. First, it answers for us to sleep on," and with a twinkle in his eye he said, "The other is that our projecting legs over the bottom of the bed answer for a perch for the poultry." When we finished tea, 2 of the members came along, each bringing a box to sit on. So what about some dates? Well, the settlement probably began in 1845. That's what a book says which talks about the area, and the first births began to be reported in 1848. So the mid-40s, and then in 1857 the Crown sold the land to Sir Watkin Williams Wynne. I believe he wanted to use it for grouse shooting and perhaps other sports, so he didn't mind the squatters living in that corner of the mountain. But he sold it to Thomas Jones of Llanysrigog Hall in 1860, and Thomas Jones wanted to charge rent because he now felt, as owner of the land, he had the right to do that. So people began to move away. You see in 1862, for example, in the local paper, an account of the eviction of Humphrey Hughes and his family. Then in 1884, it passed into the hands of George Rooper from Watford. It went into decline from the time Thomas Jones got hold of it, and by 1902 it was largely altogether vanished. So the stones were taken away and used for building a reservoir, and by 1911 the population census doesn't record anyone living there at all. Where did the people come from? Well, one person came from West Felton, one came from mid Wales, most came from nearby, Penycae, Penycae, that sort of area, elsewhere in North Wales, particularly from the Bala area. This means, of course, that they would have been mainly Welsh-speaking people rather than English-speaking people in the early days. Why did they come? Well, there was open cast, or I'm not sure if the word is open cast coal mining or drift mining, but anyway, there was coal mining. There was a quarry for sandstone or millstone grit, not a very good stone, but quite useful for building paths and roads and some other uses. There you see a photograph of it on the right, today disused, and on the left a map showing where it was. And that map was hand-drawn in 1860 at the time of the sale of the land. They also made bisums, which are brooms made by attaching heather to a long handle. And their bisums were very popular, and they were distributed very widely, well beyond Newtown, and it was quite a thriving small industry. There was also running water, something which is very important if you're going to live somewhere. The Trevechan Brook joins up with two minor streams round about the place where the hamlet was situated. The population grew until about the time that Thomas Jones bought the land. The highest number seems to be 32 households that I've been able to find a record of, and by 1901 there were only 6 households left, as you can see on that slide. That is where the village was. The map on the left is from 1873 and gives a closer view of the situation, and the one on the right is from 1963, and it shows you the area where Newtown Mountain is. So where was the actual hamlet or village? It was in those trees which you see in the distance. If you want to go there, you can walk. This is one of the paths that take you to the old village. You can actually walk through the village as well. Or I should of course say you can walk through the ruins, but you must stay on the path. The area is now covered with those trees, which are a plantation of fir trees, and if you want to go out of the path into the trees, you need to get written permission from the forester, and you will have to sign a disclaimer or a waiver regarding insurance to say that you will not make any claim against him if it should happen that on the old walls or amongst the trees you incurred any injury. You can't drive there. There is a dirt track that leads up to the settlement, but it's permanently barred by a locked gate, so you must have to walk if you want to go. Now, George Borrow went there in 1854, and he tells the story in his book Wild Wales. He didn't deliberately go there, he got lost. He was at Craigoforwyn and he was trying to get to Wrexham, but he took a wrong turning and ended up in Newtown, and this is the sort of route that he would have taken. And this is his description. He says, I came to a cart path up a heathery hill, till I saw some small grimy-looking huts, which I supposed were those of colliers. At the door of the first I saw a girl. I spoke to her in Welsh, and found she had little or none. I passed on, and seeing the door of a cabin open, I saw several grimy but chubby children. I spoke to them in English, and found that they could only speak Welsh. Presently I observed a robust woman advancing towards me. She was barefooted, and bore on her head an immense lump of coal. I spoke to her in Welsh, and found she could only speak English. The next person I met was a man in a collier's dress. He was a stout-built fellow of the middle age, with a coal-dusty, surly countenance. I asked him in Welsh if I was in the right direction for Wrexham. He answered in a surly manner in English that I was. I again spoke to him in Welsh. He said, I'd have you know that I can speak English as well as Welsh. Aye, and a good deal better. So they were a mixed group of people, some speaking only English, some speaking only Welsh, and some with a command of both. Here you see an aerial photograph of some of the ruins, and another, and another. And you can see the shape of the buildings from the ruins on those photographs. You can sometimes tell who lived where, because the 1860 hand-drawn map lists the plots with people's names, and I put a red ring around the place where Thomas and Mary Proctor lived, and in the photograph on the right I am standing in their plot. Where the photographer was standing when the photograph was taken is approximately where their small dwelling would have been. That is the hearth of Richard Edwards. Nothing else remains of his home. And that is Mary North, who was probably the woman with the immense lump of coal, because she came from England and would only have spoken English. So that is where she lived, and she lived to be 105, which was very unusual indeed in those far-off days, and that photograph of her appeared in the Strand magazine. By looking at the shapes of the walls and the buildings, and looking at the hand-drawn map as well, you can identify, as I said just now, who was where. And here are John Jones and Edward Griffiths. And there's John Jones's wall. And there are the two chapels I mentioned. The one towards the top of the photograph is the Welsh chapel, and the one towards the bottom is the English chapel. We're going to start with the Welsh one, because it was the first, and it was known as Capel. Look at the names of the people who lived nearby. They all had Welsh surnames, and they were probably all from North Wales, maybe Mid Wales, and they were no doubt Welsh speaking. Maybe some of them had no English at all. The Clwyd Powys Archaeological Trust excavated a lot of the ruins, including what I've called Capel isaf. Now that means upper chapel, and I gave it that name before we identified what it really was. We knew it was a chapel, we didn't know what sort. So the trust discovered it was a ruinous rectangular rubble stone house, measuring 7.6 metres long and 6.2 metres wide. Walls measure half a metre thick. Appears to be of one room with fireplace and chimney stack at the centre of north wall. They thought it was a house. They had no reason to believe that it was a chapel. They presumably had not seen the 1860 map, which labels it chapel. So they had a fireplace in their chapel, and I have shown you a photograph of a rather misty day, and it gets damp and it gets bitterly cold in the winter, and I imagine those old Welsh Methodists with their fire blazing perhaps in their fireplace, holding their service, having their fellowship, seeking God, seeking his blessing and his presence and his love, sometimes his forgiveness, and always the eternal life which he gives. That must have had quite an atmosphere. Now that chapel was decaying by 1863. We know this because a Mr. Wickham, who was the curate at Wrexham, visited it with a view to buying it as a school, and he left in 1863. But you will see the quotation here from the local paper, and it says of Mr. Wickham, he had heard of a public building on the mountain which was to be let, and perhaps might be bought for a trifle. It had been used at one time for a chapel, but for a few pounds could be had for a school. But we found that the walls were anything but perpendicular, and the roof was in such a state that there was strong probability that it would soon fall in. So they didn't buy it. That was 1863, or perhaps a little earlier. And there you see it when the Archaeological Trust did their excavations in 2010. And there you see it even more recently when I visited it. And you can see that it's not at all easy to find because it's disappeared amongst the trees. How do we know it was Calvinistic Methodist? Well, there's a book by Victor Evans called The Formation of the Ecclesiastical Parish of Penycae. And when he's writing about that settlement, he says in the midst of these were a number of Methodists. They moved their encampment, and many came to live in Penycae and the Groyce. This then led to the desire to build a chapel in the Groyce. After Thomas Jones began to charge rent, they began to move away down the mountain, and they helped form a new congregation which acquired a chapel and became known as Capel, which was Welsh-speaking and Calvinistic Methodist, at that part of Penycae known as the Groyce. That chapel in the picture is a later building on the same site. Capel isaf, as I called it before we knew all about it, means lower chapel, and that was primitive Methodist, built in 1861. And although the Ordnance Survey map unusually doesn't identify it as a chapel, we know that that building was the chapel because it's on a later map, 1896, a hand-drawn map. I suspect that the Ordnance Survey didn't identify it as a chapel because it was leasehold and they didn't own it and they hadn't given it over to the denomination. So that's where it stood, and that's another proof of where it stood. Here you see a Google Earth photograph and an Ordnance Survey map, one superimposed upon the other, and then the two juxtaposed as well. So that is where it stood, but as you can see, there's no sign of it now in the aerial photograph. And there I am standing on the site. The Primitive Methodist Leader, 1924, in an article called A Story of 60 Years Ago, says it was a very plain structure, no plaster on the walls or under the slates. The floor was of well-trodden earth, the benches were of unplaned wood, but rough and ready as everything was. That place, to those earnest men and women, was the house of God. That was written by Adam Lee, and here you see a photograph of him. Mr. Lee made his first attempt to preach on his 19th birthday at the mountain, where a colony of besom makers had erected a small chapel. It was a building unadorned, with bare brick walls and an earthen floor, but it was as dear to them as the temple to the ancient Jews. The year 1863 saw his removal to Mould, and he joined the Buckley Society. So we're talking now about 1863 or perhaps a little earlier, and you'll see the description there of the building unadorned, bare brick walls and an earthen floor. I don't think it was brick, I think it was sandstone from the quarry over the path, but sandstone does look rather like brick. It's the same sort of colour. The primitive Methodists had this policy of wanting to evangelise places where people had the least opportunity of hearing the gospel. I know there was a Welsh chapel, but not everybody spoke Welsh, and in any case that's beginning to become ruinous by the time the Prims started. Jesus said, "Go out to the highways and hedges and compel people to come in, that my house may be filled." So the highways and hedges, the nooks and crannies of British life, that is where the Prims went. And here is the minister who started the work, Philip Maddox, born in Flintshire at the Sarn, and he was stationed in Wrexham from 1859 to 1862. Another chapel which they acquired during his ministry was at Rhoslanna. They bought that old Welsh chapel as it had been. I dare say that by the time this photograph was taken, it had been altered substantially, and now it's disappeared altogether. This is what the account book says. "We fear there will be a falling off in the number of hearers here. Many Welsh attend from the lively nature of our worship. When the novelty is over, they will leave." So Rhoslanna was a Welsh-speaking village, but people went along to the primitive Methodist services because of the novelty of the lively worship. Now here's the membership at Newtown. First of all, you had to be on trial, and then after a period you would become a full member. It fluctuated, and you will see that it reached 25 in 1867, by which time we already know that the community was in decline numerically. We read elsewhere that it was built of stone, which they had delivered free of charge. That is why I think it came from the quarry just over the road, or the path. It cost them £23. The average attendance on a Sunday was 40, and weekdays was 20 to 25. In 1862, they had a Sunday school, 3 male teachers, 1 female, 7 male scholars, 9 female. In 1864, that had changed to 9 male scholars and 14 female. Notice that by 1866, when the village was in decline, numerically the average attendances had also gone down. 30 on Sundays, 15 in the week. And here are some other ministers who had Newtown as one church in their charge. You can see their names underneath the image of each one of them. They had love feasts. What was a love feast? Well, it was a meeting for fellowship. It would usually open with singing and prayer, and then a piece is sung by way of asking a blessing, after which the bread and water are served out. I should say that it was not a substitute for the Lord's Supper. The bread and water were simply a symbolic and very simple meal together, but not the Lord's Supper, not a communion service. The love feast collection is made and a piece sung by way of returning thanks. The preacher makes a few remarks. The people rise in succession and speak their own experience. What does that mean? Well, their experience might have been of doubt or of defeat in temptation. It might have been of victory over temptation. It might have been of answered prayer, progress in the spiritual life, aspirations, hopes, circumstances in which they felt that God had intervened on their behalf. All kinds of experiences which form part of our walk with God to this very day. And this was in order that the people may grow into faith and that the Holy Ghost may descend. Each one, it says, the people rise in succession. They would all share how they were getting on in their walk with God. Singing and prayer are occasionally introduced, and the love feast closes with prayer. They had tea meetings, and this was on Whit Monday, 1863. A tea meeting was held in the primitive Methodist chapel, Newtown. The wild precipices, the rough houses, the uncultivated people, and the unfinished chapel attracted a large assembly to the rustic scene. At 4:30, about 140 gathered around the social board and did ample justice to the rich and abundant fare provided for them. After tea, a public meeting was held, and addresses delivered by Messrs. Stacey, Jones, and Miss Bennet. When the local paper says that the chapel was unfinished in 1863, it doesn't really mean that it was necessarily unfinished, but that it gave that impression. Remember, no plaster on the walls, dirt floor. They probably thought needs a bit more work done. Haven't finished yet. Bank holiday, 1880, quite a few years later. A tea meeting is to be held in the chapel at 3:30. Tickets, a shilling each. A tram is to start from Wrexham at 11:30 to run to Johnstown on the way to the mountain, and return in the evening at 10. Fare, 2d each way. On Monday, bank holiday, the annual tea meeting was held, after which a public meeting was addressed by Mrs. Fletcher, the Reverend J. Calvert, Wrexham, and others. During the interval, outdoor games were enjoyed in a field near to. There were a large number of people present. And they had camp meetings, for example, in 1880. The primitive Methodists of Newtown Mountain held a camp meeting in the open air near the chapel. The services were conducted by Mrs. Fletcher, Connors Key, and others, and were very impressive. The camp meetings were large open-air meetings for preaching. There's a gap. Some of the archives have been lost, one of the minute books, for example, or perhaps other documents. The documentation begins again in 1884 for the circuit, not simply for Newtown. But that circuit documentation has no further reference to Newtown, 1884 onwards, so we may assume that by then the chapel was not being used and the congregation had faded out. This was the decline of the settlement, population down to 14, 5 households in 1881. 1896, the chapel was already in a state of some ruin or at least disrepair. George Senior of Wrexham took out a lease to convert it to a dwelling, not for himself, but I think for some of his relatives. In 1898, Samuel Downes was born at Chapel House, Newtown. The little boy was a cousin of George Senior's wife. So George Senior took out that lease to help prepare a home for some relatives. Now the community and the chapel both came to an end. We've seen something of the end of the chapel's life as a place of worship. And the 1896 lease which George Senior took out to repair the disused chapel gave permission for him to use stones which were lying around in the repairs that he would do. Now that implies that buildings and walls had already been abandoned nearby, so not only the chapel but the community as a whole. By 1901, the Downes family had moved to Avonatha Road in Penycae, and the chapel became used as one of the centres for besom making. In 1902, the village was purchased by Wrexham Water Company, and the stones were taken away to build that new reservoir which you see in the photograph. And when you get to 1912, the Ordnance Survey map shows no building at all where the primitive Methodist chapel had stood. So as I say, you can still visit the ruins of the village. There isn't much to see, and don't forget you must get permission and sign a document about insurance if you leave the public footpath. Nonetheless, I know that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. Those Welsh-speaking and English-speaking Methodists found forgiveness and peace and life which will go on forever through their faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. And I know that whatever God does endures forever, because that was God working within them and among them.